And welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being so engaged in both the sessions. We come to the final keynote of this symposium, and it will be delivered by Mr. Ghulam Omar Qargha. I hope I've been pronouncing your name right, sir. Okay, thank you. Sir is a fellow at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings and an education, research, and program evaluation expert with 20 years of overseas experience in designing, managing, implementing, and evaluating international education programs. Karga's expertise is in policy analysis, program design, education transfer, and research on teacher education, curriculum development, educational delivery, and monitoring and evaluation in the developing world, with a particular focus on fragile, conflict affected, and emergency contexts. Mr. Karga brings this expertise to enrich and continue Brookings' work on scaling educational innovations for systemic improvement in low and middle income countries around the world. It's a very diverse spectrum of work. We welcome you, Mr. Karga. Please carry on.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. This has been a wonderful experience, wonderful 2 days. I've learned quite a bit from everything, all of the discussions that we've had. I'm not an expert of India's educational system, but I think I got a good crash course over the last 2 days. So I've been given the difficult task of kind of talking at the end. A lot of what I had planned to discuss has already been discussed in some format. So in one way, it's good I'm wrapping up. In another, you might hear some repetition, and that's I think, good. So first of all, thank you, Madhikar and Leadership for Equity, who is a partner of Brookings, for inviting me to this, and to Flame University for hosting a beautiful campus, by the way. I start by talking about why I'm here, what Brookings Institution does. Madhikar was kind enough to come to DC. He attended our symposium, our 20th year celebration for the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. And that's where the conversation started to come to India. Brookings is a nonprofit organization. I believe it's the oldest think tank in the world, 1910. We are known for the Marshall Plan that Europe was redeveloped on. A lot of Brookings' work is focused on domestic policy, US policy. About 50 years ago, we opened up global economy and development. And the global economy and development focus has been on cutting edge research, policy, and programmatic suggestions for policymakers. And a lot of it does focus on economy as well, growth of economy in the global South and global North to some extent. 20 years ago, we started the Center for Universal Education. The Center for Universal Education sits within global economy and development. However, our focus is not so much on economy, but doing global research on education to talk about how policies can lead to inclusive education, to a breadth of skills, which is a term that we have coined, which means a lot of what we've talked about, that education is more than just about the skills for employment. It's about social emotional learning. It's about ability to anchor oneself morally, spiritually, all of these things. So that's been the focus of our research. We've produced a lot of policy-related materials, and part of the reason I'm here is because as an internal reflection of 20 years, we said, what can we do that would be our contribution to this conversation at the global stage. We don't implement projects, we don't fund people, so we're in this, and we're not a university, we're in this really weird position. But we do have a good platform in which we try to produce unbiased research that is actionable, related to policies. And for that, our reflection was that one of the best things that we can do is to elevate local voices. Instead of speaking for local voices, to use our platform to get all of these ideas and what is usually the global north discussions that forms a lot of policies for donors and these entities. So when I got the invitation, I said, I'm not going to get a lot of chances to see how a country's system really works and listen to experts from the country. So again, the disclaimer is I'm not an expert on India. If I say anything that's wrong, please excuse me. I got the crash course, but I'm not the best student. So I'm going to focus on 3 questions. And my goal is to go through these in the next 25, 30 minutes, and then spend hopefully about 15 minutes in question and answer and discussion, because I think that's where a lot of good conversation comes out. So why do we need educational system transformation? What is educational system transformation, and how can we do that? That's basically the 3 main points that I'm going to try to make in the next 20, 30 minutes. So why do we need this thing that we've been talking about for the last 2 days, education system transformation? And I think all of those words are key, and I'm going to come to each one of them. We have heard over the last 2 days that the world is at an inflection point. There's climate change, the nature of work is changing, conflict and authoritarianism is on the increase. COVID, there's advances with AI and how we learn and the questions of what knowledge really means. And with this inflection point, there's an increased recognition that our current schooling system, and I'm using the term schooling system rather than educational system consciously here, our current schooling systems are failing to meet our needs. That's a conversation that about a decade ago was not as prominent. This is becoming more prominent. OECD has acknowledged this in their Education 2030 report. GPE's 2025 report also focuses on the need to transform education. And UNESCO's Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, kind of brought a lot of this discussion about systems transformation into the international arena. It culminated with the UN General Assembly's focus last year on this topic, to talk about how can we transform our educational systems. I'm a stickler for definitions. So transformation is different than reform. Reform usually means trying to remedy things within the existing system. Transformation is to transform and perhaps get a new system. However, the conversations that we have been having don't seem to make that distinction very often. Sometimes it gets blurred. We're talking about reforms to our current systems and using the word transformation. Sometimes we're using transformation and we mean reform. So I think part of this difficulty is coming to terms, creating dialogue so that we have shared definitions. What do we mean by education systems? This is my claim 1. Schooling is not synonymous with education. I think this is an obvious point, but I think it's a point that needs to be made. We have done a lot of publications recently focusing on this issue. that education includes non-formal, informal, as well as the formal schooling system. But we just privilege the formal education, schooling system and call that the entirety of education. We know that's not the reality of education. We learn throughout our lives, and we learn through different institutions. The historical element, which was mentioned in several of the talks, is important to recognize. Educational systems have existed for centuries, for 1,000 years, as long as humanity goes back. You have the Kyujo system in China, you have the Dabiristan system and Afghanistan, present-day Iran, that dates back 800 years or so. You have the Gurukul system here, the madrasa. So there's the liberal arts curriculum, the apprenticeship models. There were many different systems of education that functioned and are functioning alongside schooling. And even in modern terminology, we have community-based schools. We have MOOCs, we have certificate programs, we have homeschooling programs, we have recreational activities, we have museums. So there's a lot of education that takes place. So when we're talking about education system reform, we need to think of the bigger picture and not just limit ourselves to schooling system reform. The reason being that appreciating the multiple educational pathways opens up a lot of possibilities. It helps us make education more relevant. It gives us the flexibility to deal with these tremendous challenges of doing a lot of things within a short period of time and limited resources. I'll go through this part a little bit more quickly, but I think this is important. People have touched on this to some extent. So modern schooling is an 18th century phenomena that goes back to what was happening in Europe, modern day Germany, that kind of started the structure of the current schooling model. It was culturally rooted, philosophically rooted, and it wanted to solve a particular problem of moving from kingdoms to nation states, and there was a new mechanism needed to prepare people. There was the Industrial Revolution, there was the Enlightenment, all of these political things were happening. It was mainly happening in Europe. Today, there is not a nation that doesn't do formal schooling, even a place like Afghanistan, which has a lot of problems, the current government, but modern schooling is the staple of their educational system. I think the point that's really important here to take away with is that, and I'll get to this a little bit later on as well, that there was an intentional spread of the schooling model through colonization, and we have talked about this. It was to spread the colonizers' culture, it was to produce a workforce, so it made education constricted and for particular purposes. After colonization, there's a lot of literature on educational transfer and what that means. There is elements of the same dynamics, and I'll get to that a little bit later on in terms of times. The other thing is we're talking about systems. We need to, there are many different types of systems. And we need to define what is a system within education. And most of the educational system thinking has been linear. A lot of our frustration is we want linear solutions to a reality that's not linear. And we get frustrated. Why isn't this not happening? Well, because that's not the reality that we're dealing with. We need to move to more complex understanding of systems, human-based understanding of systems, and away from the nonlinear systems, and I've been using the word ecosystems more often. I haven't coined that, but I like the idea of an ecosystem for education rather than a system. So I would say transforming educational ecosystems rather than systems. And then there's another issue that I think has been touched upon by several speakers. A lot of our research about education, a lot of our understanding about education comes from especially since 1960s, from the field of economics. Economic research has dominated educational research. Agricultural research has also had influences on educational research. More recently, there's more talks of health influences. The RCTs are a good example of what has worked in the health sector. We wanted to replicate it in the educational sector. With this transformation, I think it's important that we expand how we're looking at education, bringing in philosophy, humanities, history, and cultural perspectives that have always been staples of education needs to come and rebalance this education. Not that economic research is not important. We have made a lot of advances by using economic research to understand how educational systems work. But privileging that field over everything else gives us a narrow perspective. Again, then we want a multitude of results and we're not getting it. How can we transform educational systems? I'll do this section with a disclaimer. There's no answer to this. And I think that's part of the finding, is there's no one-size-fits-all answer. And I think that element has been the negative side of economic research on education. We think that if we can do regression analysis, if we can do RCTs, if we can do even basic statistics, then we can figure out what works in Milwaukee and transfer it to Pune, India. It doesn't work that way. There's some lessons that we can have, but it doesn't work that way. So we have, I think, 4 areas of focus areas that are important. Number one, and we had this discussion just before I came in, I think central to the discussion about transformation is education for what? Purposes of education have to drive our discussions. Otherwise, we will be talking in different spheres, we would be talking about different things, and then we end up at the same place that we're at. There are many, many purposes of education. Purposes of schooling have usually, and especially in the last, after modernization, have privileged economic development, productivity. However, modern schooling also started by, before the economic purpose, it was national identity. And now it's civic engagement is included in that. But there's liberation and critical consciousness, Paulo Freire's ideas about education. There's well-being and flourishing, which is more of a topic that's being talked about, thriving as a holistic approach to education. There's the culturally and spiritually and morally sustaining education that has been part of educational systems from a long time ago. None of these are either or, but we have to have that conversation in terms of what are the purposes of educational transformation. What does, for example, India need at this time and place? And what do different states in India need at this time and place? And come to a mutual agreement about what our shared vision is. Once we have a discussion about purpose and dialogue and create a shared vision, Then we move into content. I'm not going to get into that because that's a completely different area, and I don't have the time, but develop curriculum materials based on that shared vision. A lot of discussion now kind of jumps purpose and content and goes directly to pedagogy because it deals with teachers. And we say, okay, how the way that we change educational systems is to make teachers teach better, and then all of these things would come to fruition. And we know from decades and decades of and billions of dollars spent on this that that doesn't work. Pedagogy is extremely complex and multidimensional concept. There's observable elements of pedagogy, how the technical elements of how a teacher teaches. Then there are the non-observable ideological aspects, what the teacher brings in with them that actually drives what the motivations are, what the incentives are. Those are actually the drivers that drive the observable pedagogical change. Pedagogy is also a moral, ethical, cultural, political, and technical activity. I'll give you an example of Botswana. There's a really good researcher by the name of Richard Tablois in Botswana that talks about pedagogies and why student-centered pedagogies haven't been taken on in Africa. The usual answer to that is because, well, the teachers are not doing a good job. We need to teach them better. There's something, the deficit model. And a lot of the research that he's done is that teachers don't think that's the best strategy for them, ideologically, practically, structurally. But because of how the world works, it's seldom that those teachers will voice that. They would say, yes, I'll do student-centered. But that dialogue doesn't take place. Another focus area is to, once you have purpose, content, some pedagogical understanding and shared, then to talk about position of how do you align these systems for your specific context. Power plays a dominant role throughout this process. What gets funded, what gets highlighted, and you have to understand the power dynamics. If we just take the rational perspective, this is what we think works, X, Y, Z, and then we get frustrated why it's not working, it's because of all these complexities. The other three areas are important areas, but I don't have the time to get into a lot of details of these. I've touched upon them a little bit. Number one is that we need to expand our learning environments beyond schooling, move to ecosystems rather than schools. We want schools to produce everything for us in society. We have all of those purposes in the back of our minds, and then we say, why aren't our schools producing that? Because, and by schools we usually mean teachers, because there is a limited time. Teachers are dealing with 60, 70 students. They have to meet assessment criteria, all of those things. Related to that is we need to widen the profile of educators. We can't place all of our societal hopes and dreams on teachers. We have to define their role in this and define other people's roles in them. And the challenge is, how do you make that happen? Which is the last point in this, which is credentialing. We know that education takes place throughout the ecosystem, but not everything is credentialed. So if it's not credentialed, then the focus doesn't come there. I think part of how we can use technology better is to learn and figure out mechanisms of how we can credential educational systems that happen within schools, outside of schools, with teachers, and with other actors. So those were focus areas. Um, the next part of this is sort of a lot of what we've been talking about. How does the process of transformation take place? I talked about linear models versus nonlinear models. One model that I like, and I think it does a fairly good job, no model does all of the things that we want. It's the multiple streams framework that originally Kingdon put forward for policymaking, and other researchers have advanced that further now. You will hear a lot of repetition of what was even talked about just most recently. We have hopes of how systems work, and we have realities of how. I think, again, being realistic and understanding the systems that we're working with is critical. Organizational decision-making results from context-dependent, structural, cognitive, and affective processes. There's emotions involved, there's context involved, there's structural issues involved, and there's different ways of looking at cognition. It's not as simple as computer programming in some ways, although I'm sure computer programming is difficult, but there's, especially when we talk about public entities. We have a lot of NGO representation here, but even there, between NGOs and ministries of education, the context is different. NGOs don't deal with the same challenges that governments deal with. So I've spent my life with NGOs, and we tend to get frustrated at government, and I used to get extremely frustrated with governments and how they dealt with it. And then I spent some time on the other side of the aisle, and I was like, oh, these people have some problems that I didn't really recognize. Decision-making in organizations are nonlinear. They don't follow an orderly process. That's the reality of it. It's not whether we like it or not, it's the reality that outcomes are pretty independent from other elements within the system. There are parallel processes that are taking place independently. And there's a push and pull. Not everybody is going to agree with everything, and this is because there are no answers that are clear-cut for all of the stakeholders. A lot of time we get frustrated. We know this thing works. Why aren't you accepting it? Because it doesn't. Organizations work in a field of ambiguity. There is no clear answer to a lot of these things. There are many stakeholders, and this is exacerbated by fluid participation, meaning that people go in and out, and we have talked about this. You have a district supervisor, he changes. You have a minister, he changes. You have a principal, he changes. So with every fluid participation or change and participation, a new set of problems comes into fore. There's problematic preferences, meaning that not everybody's goal is not the same. This is a political system. This is a human system. People have different preferences. One person might be there to advance themselves politically. Another has an ideological perspective about how things should be. Another person is there for the pay. Another person. So when we're introducing change into the system, it affects all of these different players. And we have to recognize that that's the reality of it. And the last 2 points are sort of kind of winding down this discussion and going into more practical things as far as what we could potentially do. Again, I don't want to sound very dire and that this is the situation, we can't do anything about it. I think we can. And the first step of that is, in the US, they have Alcoholics Anonymous. And they say that the first step to solving your problem is to acknowledge the problem. And I think with educationalists, we need an Educationalist Anonymous group to acknowledge that there are these problems within our systems. And in a state of ambiguity, timing and data are much more important than rationality. The critical factor is who pays attention to what at what time. That's how decisions in public policy get made. What gets highlighted? What are catastrophic events have an incredible role in this. COVID-19 made public policy changes that people could not have made for decades and decades, because that's what was front and center. So timing becomes incredibly important in the type of data that you're sharing. Information is a essential commodity, but information is not value neutral. I've spent probably more than now almost 3 decades in educational research, and one of the big findings that I have is educational research, there's really no value neutral finding in educational research. It depends who the researcher. Give me any type of research, whether it's qualitative and quantitative in your raw data, I could probably come up with a different analysis than what you have come up with. And this is part of the problem. So the reality of research is more about, and political manipulation sounds negative, but it's not really meant to be negative. It's just part of this use of data is being smart enough to use data in a way at a time with a person that makes the decisions. And I'll go back a little bit and then I'll go forward. So this is all part of the sort of the multiple streams framework. What do you do in this kind of a framework? The political manipulation is what the policy entrepreneurs are mentioned there. We're all policy entrepreneurs. We have solutions that we think are solving problems, and a lot of the times they're not. There's a solution that wants to find a problem rather than a problem looking to find a solution. But we're policy entrepreneurs. Within government, there are policy entrepreneurs. Donors have policy entrepreneurs. So it really depends on the context. You have these 3 streams. You have the problem stream. What is the country, the state, the locality focused on? And that's where the data comes in. What gets highlighted? What are the indicators? What does the news coverage highlight? Then you have the political stream, who is in power, what their political ideologies are, what they want to accomplish, how long are they going to be in power. And then you have the policy stream, which is usually what the solution is. The linear model draws across these. You have the problem, you have the solution, and then you go forward. This model says that the job of the policy entrepreneur, all of us, it's an art more than a science. It is to curate and bring these things together and in a way in which it produces a policy window. And this is where it becomes a little bit more difficult. We don't control the policy window. So some of this is a waiting game. You have to wait for that policy window to open, whether it's a positive thing or something as catastrophic as COVID. A lot of distance learning got pushed through in COVID because people who saw that policy window had the ready-made solution, had the connections within the political streams, made that happen. Once you do that, then an output might come to fruition. No guarantees. I want to go through this and then one more slide and I'll be done. We are in the global south. Processes of educational transfer has been a critical part of how we look at education. So there are two extremes. Coercive transfer is kind of what happened during colonization. This is the system, take it, you have to do it. On the other extreme is the lesson drawing what we hope it really never really happens, which is the perfect rationality model. This, we have learned from RCTs that this intervention works, so we have all the data, this is how you do it, X, Y, and Z, and sort of as an engineering model, let's implement it. That never really happens. A lot of where we're at with policy transfer is sort of in the middle. From what's my left, I guess, lesson drawing, a lot of the discussions that we have been doing, what is the US doing and what is somebody else doing that could be relevant for India without the really coercive elements. But that also, in reality, doesn't really, it is there to some extent, but it's more about the voluntary legitimacy part that we want to emulate. There's a whole group of people that focus on new institutionalization, that if you go to any classroom anywhere in the world, they pretty much look the same. Part of that is because we want to emulate what we think are successful models. So it's a voluntary, but there's a little bit of a coercive element to it because who's the model and why are they the model and not somebody else? A little side note here. My first work experience was teaching in inner city Jacksonville, Florida, US of A. A lot of the problems we're talking here exist in the US. I had an ulcer, the hardest job. I worked in Afghanistan with the war. That wasn't as hard as working in inner city Jacksonville, Florida, because 10 to 12 graders could not read, and I was supposed to teach them chemistry. But the US is sort of what we aspire to be, and usually use. That legitimacy comes through many different ways. Obligated transfer is a lot of educational development programs in the world are obligated transfers. These are donor-funded projects that are designed with minimal input from countries, and we sign them and we have to implement them. And then you get into conditionalities, structural adjustment plans that we were having this conversation last night, in terms of depending on how strong the country is, an entity like World Bank can come and say, for you to be able to get funding and loans, you have to structurally adjust your program. So that's when you start getting more and more towards the right. Okay, so moving forward, what are we doing and what can we do? I think you guys are doing excellent work. I think that just the conversation that we've had over the last 2 days highlights the importance and the sophistication at which you're tackling the issues, and I think India is in a very, very good place for many different reasons. You have a window of opportunity that many other countries don't. And our little small area, being our meaning the Center for Universal Education. So I'm leading a new project called Sparks, strengthening pedagogical approaches for relevant, and I want to highlight relevant, knowledge and skills. It's not a very complex project. It's based on the premise that pedagogical change requires open and honest dialogue. There are no ready-made solutions that works everywhere. We need to have these conversations more and more and get into the granular level even further. The Sparks project, which over the next 2-3 years aims to produce practical and collaborative learning that addresses some of these questions, and it does it by 2 ways. We're setting up an international peer learning network focused on advancing dialogues on pedagogies so that multiple perspectives are presented. We understand what pedagogy means in India, what it means in Zimbabwe, what it means in New York, what it means. And so having dialogue, I think, is extremely important. And then the next part of this is establishing, we talked about collaborative research and action research yesterday. The model that we are using, and this is based on a lot of work that Brookings has done, research practice partnerships is a model of collaborative research that's predominantly in the US, but I think it has, again, issue of transfer, but it has practical applications that I think can solve some of these research questions that we have. The slight difference between action research and research policy practice partnerships is action research doesn't involve all of the stakeholders. What we aim to do is to create maybe 3 to 5, depending on the funding that we get, research policy practice partnerships that bring in all stakeholders at local sites. These are researchers, teachers, policymakers, civil society. Bring them together as a collaborative research effort to design what, I'm getting the 5-minute mark. I'll be done before 5 minutes, hopefully. Design research that is relevant, that can change policy. By having policymakers as part of your research team, by having civil society as part of your research team, by having parents, students, teachers, and a researcher, a university, or this creates a community that can define the problems that they want to address. Defining the problem of research is directly related to power. What's important to you might not be important to the teacher or the parent. And then designing in ways that work in your local environment. I've done research for 20 years, and every environment is different. You have to be responsive in your design to make sure that your research captures data in a way that's as accurate as possible within your environment. And then most importantly, sharing that information. Who needs to hear this information? Where are the change levers? And our experience has been by including policymakers and other stakeholders in the research team, there is much more movement out of research than research that comes purely from an academic perspective. Last point on this, Our role in these research practice partnerships would be facilitators. That's why it's called Sparks. We want to just create a spark, but the real work actually should be done locally. And thank you very much. If you're interested in the peer learning network and the research practice partnerships, please send me an email. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Actually, I think I did pretty good with my timing. I would like to, open up for question. And how much time do we have? 10 minutes. Doesn't have to be question, comments. You have, if you want to disagree with anything I said, I'm perfectly fine with that as well. So, floor is yours.
And of course, the way you brought in Steiner Kamsey, Verga style analysis with 1987 work of Kingdon. I mean, that was great, absolutely. With respect to agenda setting and policy window. So thanks for that. And I just want to comment on one thing and then bring it back to the neo-institutionalist theorization of isomorphism that you referred to, right? And this refers also to the discussions that we were having last night. So with respect to the post-colonial countries, right, 1960s, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa and India as well. So during that time, the economic and the cultural, there was a kind of, they had, of course, very different kind of theorization, but there was homogeneity in both, right? Because the statist pedagogy was homogeneous. They feared because of the violence that preceded, right? In India, as well as in Sub-Saharan Africa. So because of the violence that preceded, we all went for some kind of unity, homogeneity, fear of differences, fear of all sorts of things, right? Heterogeneity, basically, cultural differences. And then, of course, you mentioned agricultural economics. Well, Theodore Schultz was from UW-Madison, my alma mater. Right. And he was, the doyen of human capital theory, right? So, and he worked on India, Green Revolution. So fantastic, the theorization, the pointers that you put up there was great. Now, with respect to that, so basically, if we look at path dependency, right, that history matters. We are still dealing with that kind of history, right, of some kind of centralized homogeneity. Now, we have isomorphism at one level. And then we were also discussing the privatization, the notion of privatization that we think is like the Indian privatization is similar to, say, the US privatization. It's not. And yet it looks similar. It looks isomorphistic. So how do you think we put these two theorizations together? Isomorphism versus this path-dependent procedure that kind of solidified in the post-1990s decade. And if you just think about that, like maybe juxtapose Anderson-Levitt kind of literature. Yeah. Can you just respond to that? Thanks.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I don't know if I have an answer, but I can give you some general thoughts on that. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, for example, privatization, in the discussions about privatization of education in the US are definitely completely different than what it means for India, for Afghanistan, for Sub-Saharan Africa, because at the heart of that privatization debate in the US is who are you answering to? The push against privatization in the US is centered around the issue that if you privatize, public voice is taken away. In countries that are donor dependent, the public systems in some countries, 80% of it gets funded through the donor funding. So public funding becomes, public education becomes answerable first to the donors and then to the public. So that is where the problem takes place. But privatization at a global stage does look the same. you have Bridge International and other entities working at the global stage. So I think the difference becomes parsing this out and defining whether we're talking at global stage or at local stage. The same thing that looks like privatization everywhere else globally, locally might look different. And I think potentially parsing that out becomes important, acknowledging it becomes important, and I think it's getting philosophy and history and humanities back into the discussion becomes the vehicles through these things, how these things can be discussed. Schultz's ideas, Rousseau's ideas, all of these are firmly anchored in philosophies. And we have to see whether those philosophies actually make sense for us or not.
I think that this is one of the really, I thought I knew quite a bit about these things, but yours was very illuminating. And I especially like the idea of looking at the ecosystem, because I think that most of us who are involved in solutions to these big problems or small problems, the educational system, whether it's learning outcomes or whatever it is, we only tend to look at the system itself, teachers, administrators, officers, policy, etc. But I do think that we now need to look at the entire ecosystem, all right, which are also beneficiaries. It reminds me of an earlier book, Illich, Deschooling Society, who was one of the earlier people who tried to emphasize the importance of that we can do without schools. I think he took it to the extreme, but the importance of other institutions that educate and how we need to develop those and maybe to conceptualize our thinking of educational change with these other players in the game. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words and very important comment on looking at ecosystems. And I think what's happening in the world, I think there is a window of opportunity opening up towards moving towards ecosystems, because getting away from a educational system is probably the most difficult system in any society to change, because there's emotions, there's high stakes, and partly that has been the reason why it's been so slow to change. But the current situation in which the schooling model is being challenged from a policy perspective, from a technology perspective, it's kind of creating more momentum to potentially go towards a reimagining new systems that work within our environments. Yes.
Thank you for everything you said. I resonate with everything. But as a thought experiment, if I look at, to use very black and white terms, the oppressors and the oppressed. Often the oppressors are much smaller in number, even if they have more disproportionate power. So is there a way to rescue the oppressor from being the oppressor? Is the question that I want to explore. And among this category, I've long felt that there is need for a very strong donor education program, so that donors can harm their own donees' work much less than they're doing currently. And I was wondering if research can play a role in highlighting, how donors' work, which donor practices have actually been counterproductive, and what they ought to do differently. Maybe an RCT is actually needed there. I mean, I'm not very fond of RCTs, but I think so. Your comment on, donor-directed research or donor action-directed research, and if it could help us shift things a little.
Yeah, that's a million-dollar question. The oppressor oppressed. In some ways, this is part of our human history, unfortunately, and then you have the cycle of the oppressor, oppressed being the oppressor, and so I don't have an answer for that part. I think in terms of the research, a small window that we have found is if we can do this collaborative research in which, for example, focusing on donor harm, on pedagogical approaches to education and donor limitations. If we can highlight that, get that research done, put it on a platform, share it, hopefully it will create some ripple effects, but no easy. Yes, I think it's worth and related to the questions of what countries fund. I think country-funded research, expending time and energy. One of the things that I found really interesting in your presentation, I didn't see education on that list of priorities that were funded nationally in terms of research. So I think lobbying at the national level, at the local level, at the university level, to get more of this locally driven research and then connecting it with research outlets. And the good things about technology is we have social media. We can get research out much easier now than we could when you had to go and search for the journals in your library. So I think that means our time is done. Thank you. Thank you all. This was a wonderful experience.
He's given out so many felicitation kits. Now it's his turn.